I've been hiking and camping alone for most of my adult life. I'm not the most social person, and getting out into the woods helps quiet my thoughts. I prefer solo trips into remote areas where there's no cell signal, no trails, and no noise except wind in the trees and maybe the crackling of a campfire. There's a certain peace in it, the kind of peace you don't find in towns or cities. I always plan my trips carefully, bring extra food, a GPS, topo maps, first aid, everything. I don't take dumb risks. I stay sharp because out there you only get one chance if something goes wrong. Last October, I took a week off work and headed out to a national forest in the Pacific Northwest. I'm not going to name it, not because I think someone would go looking, but because part of me doesn't want to think too hard about it. The forest is huge, with thousands of acres of dense trees, hills, and old logging roads that haven't seen a truck in decades. That's what drew me in. I found a spot on a satellite map that looked perfect. It was about 12 miles from the nearest forest road, tucked between two ridgelines with a small creek running through the valley. No official trails went anywhere near it. It was deep, remote, and quiet. The hike took a day and a half. I parked my truck off a gravel road, hiked a few miles on an old logging path, then cut straight into the woods using my compass and GPS. The ground was rough, a lot of brush, fallen trees, and steep slopes. I saw elk tracks, a few old bear scat piles, and once I spooked a mountain lion I never actually saw, just heard crashing through the undergrowth above me. That's how wild it was. No boot prints, no litter, nothing to show anyone had been there in years. Just the kind of place I like. By the time I got to the spot I'd marked, my legs were sore, and my pack had rubbed a raw spot on one shoulder. But it was beautiful. The trees were old growth, huge Douglas firs and western red cedars towering above mossy ground. The little creek ran clear and cold, lined with flat rocks and fallen branches. I set up camp just above the creek, near a hollowed-out tree stump I thought could work as an emergency gear stash if the weather turned. I pitched my tent, filtered water, made a fire pit, and cooked a hot meal. That first night was peaceful, just the sound of running water and distant owls. I remember sitting by the fire, feeling lucky to have a place like that all to myself. It wasn't until the second night that things started feeling off. That day, I'd hiked a few miles further up the valley to explore. I found an old rusted metal barrel, half buried in the dirt. It looked like someone had dumped trash out there years ago, maybe a hunter or logger. I took a picture of it, then kept moving. The trees got thicker as I went, and the valley narrowed into a tight ravine. Around mid-afternoon, I turned back. As I walked, I started to notice things I hadn't seen on the way in. Broken branches, scattered pieces of bone, small ones like rabbit or squirrel. At first, I thought nothing of it. Nature's messy, but the bones weren't chewed. They were clean, like they'd been snapped and stripped. Then I saw a boot print in a patch of mud, fresh and deep, like someone had passed through that same day. That shouldn't have bothered me. I don't own the forest, but it did, because I hadn't seen or heard a soul since I left the road. No distant voices, no campfire smoke, nothing. Back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder while I cooked dinner. I didn't light a fire that night, didn't want to give away my position. Just sat in the dark, eating from my mess kit, ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. But there was nothing, just the creek and wind in the trees. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. I'd set up my food bag in a bear hang the first night. 20 feet up a tree, rope looped over a branch, tied off on the trunk. Standard procedure. That morning, the rope was cut. Not torn, not chewed. Cut clean through. My food bag was gone. Not dragged off, not scattered. Just gone. I checked the ground all around, but there were no tracks, no claw marks, no signs of a bear. Just the frayed end of the rope hanging from the branch. That's when I knew someone had been at my camp. Someone with a knife. My stomach nodded. I did a quick inventory. Tent untouched, pack still zipped up, GPS still in the top pocket. But that didn't make me feel better. Someone had come close enough to mess with my stuff and hadn't taken anything useful. Just the food. That's what got to me. If it were a thief, they'd have taken the GPS, maybe even the whole pack. But they only took the food, and they made sure I'd notice. I told myself to stay calm. I'd brought extra ration bars and had enough for a couple more days. I could cut the trip short, hike out early. But the idea of packing up and hiking alone for 12 miles with someone possibly following me didn't sit right. So I stayed another night. I moved camp about a quarter-mile uphill, hidden behind a thick patch of brush. I didn't cook, didn't light a fire. I just sat inside my tent, dead quiet, listening. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of sticks snapping. Not the soft rustling of an animal, but the heavy crunch of a boot on dry twigs. Then silence. I held my breath and strained my ears. Nothing. Then another step. Closer this time. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. It was pitch black. I could barely make out the shapes of trees, but something was out there. I sat there frozen for what felt like an hour. The steps came and went, sometimes near, sometimes distant. Then they stopped completely. No sound, no wind, just a dead stillness. I must have nodded off sitting up, because the next thing I remember, it was dawn. Pale light filtered through the trees, and everything was quiet again. I didn't waste time. I packed everything in 15 minutes and started moving fast. No breakfast, just my GPS and some trail mix in my pocket. I didn't follow the exact route I came in on. I took a longer path around the ridge, trying to avoid leaving a trail. But something felt wrong all day, like I was being herded. Every time I tried to take a shortcut or go off course, the forest seemed to push me back. Thick brush, fallen trees, slopes too steep to climb. It was like the woods were forcing me to stay on a certain path. By mid-afternoon, I stopped to rest and drink from a stream. That's when I saw it, hanging from a tree branch above the creek. My food bag, the same one that was stolen. It was tied with the same rope, hanging just high enough to see clearly. But it was empty. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Whoever took it had gone through the trouble of hanging it in my path. They wanted me to find it. That was the final straw. I hiked until nightfall, barely stopping. I didn't care if I was making noise. I just wanted out. I found a small clearing and forced myself to rest for a few hours, but I didn't sleep. Every sound made me flinch. I had my knife in one hand the whole time, just gripping it tight, listening. Nothing came close, but I never stopped feeling like something was watching. I made it back to the truck the next evening, scratched up, starving, and exhausted. I didn't relax until I was halfway down the mountain road. Cell service came back, and I saw a text from my sister asking how the trip was going. When I got home, I washed everything, cleaned my gear, and tried to forget about it. But I kept going over the same details again and again. That boot print, the cut rope, the food bag. Someone was out there, deep in those woods. They didn't want to hurt me. If they did, they had the chance. But they wanted me to feel watched, controlled, like I wasn't alone, even in the most remote place I could find. I haven't gone solo camping since. I still hike, but only on trails, only during the day. I haven't set foot more than a few miles from a road since then. That trip taught me something I didn't expect. Not about nature, but about people. Because the woods aren't empty. They never were. And the scariest thing out there isn't a bear or a storm or getting lost. It's the person who doesn't want to be found. The one who watches from the shadows. The one who waits for someone to come far enough in, and then makes sure they leave different than they came. I don't usually tell people about this trip anymore. It's one of those stories that just doesn't come out right when you try to explain it. People think you're exaggerating or that it couldn't have been that bad. But I lived it, every second of it. Every mile, every mosquito bite, every cold, endless night. It was the scariest and most exhausting thing I've ever gone through. And the worst part is how normal it all started. It was late September when I headed out. I had been working nonstop all summer, barely taking a day off, and I needed something to reset my brain. I thought a solo backpacking trip deep into the woods would do the trick. I'd done dozens of hikes before, some of them pretty tough, but I felt like I needed something more remote this time, something challenging. I chose an area in northern Montana, not too far from the Canadian border, called the Deadfall Trail. It wasn't well known, and that was the appeal. A string of old logging paths, deep forest routes, and barely marked game trails that cut through miles of dense wilderness. No towns for hours in any direction. No cell signal. I figured I'd be completely alone out there for 4 days. That's exactly what I wanted. The first day went well. I parked my truck at a pull-off just off a gravel forest road. There was no real parking lot or official trailhead, just a small clearing where people sometimes left their vehicles. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, food for 5 days just in case, a basic med kit, a knife, water filter, map, compass, and a hand crank emergency radio. I'd leave my GPS behind this time, trying to keep things old school. I wanted it to feel like a real disconnect from the world. I hiked about 12 miles in the first day, sticking to the main trail and making good time. The weather was cool and dry, and the trail followed a small creek most of the way, winding through thick pine and spruce. I saw some deer in the early afternoon and heard elk bugling somewhere in the distance. The forest was peaceful in that heavy, quiet way where every step on dry leaves seems too loud. I made camp just before sunset near a bend in the creek. I built a small fire, cooked a freeze-dried meal, and fell asleep not long after dark. The second day things started to feel off. I didn't notice it right away, not at first. It was just a little shift in atmosphere, a sense that something had changed. I woke up before sunrise, packed up, and started hiking again. The trail got steeper, climbing up into thicker woods. The trees grew closer together, and the path narrowed, sometimes disappearing completely for short stretches. It wasn't marked very well, but I'd studied the topographic maps for days before coming out here. I kept checking my compass, and I knew I was still heading the right direction. Around midday, I found what looked like old logging debris, cut logs, rusted metal parts, maybe from some equipment that had been abandoned decades ago. The forest had grown over most of it, vines wrapping through rusted frames, moss covering bent wheels. Felt like stepping back in time. That's when I noticed the first real problem. No more animal sounds, not even birds. The forest was dead quiet, unnaturally quiet. I stood still for a few minutes, just listening. Nothing, not a single chirp or rustle. The silence made me anxious. I told myself maybe it was just the elevation or the cooler air that day, or maybe I was reading too much into it. I pushed on, trying to ignore it. But every hour after that, I felt more uneasy. I kept glancing over my shoulder, even though I hadn't seen another person since leaving my truck. Still, I had that feeling, like I was being watched, like someone was there, just out of sight. By late afternoon, I had only made about 8 miles. I was tired and frustrated. The terrain had gotten rough, full of deadfall and steep drop-offs. I had to climb over logs, backtrack around boulders, and once I even slipped and fell into a shallow creek, soaking one boot and bruising my shin. I cursed out loud and decided to stop for the day earlier than planned. I found a flat spot off the trail near a cluster of rocks and set up my tent. That night was one of the longest of my life. The wind picked up around midnight, moaning through the trees in long, low whistles. It wasn't just wind, though. There were other sounds, soft cracks and crunches, like someone stepping carefully through the woods. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, knife gripped in one hand, staring up at the roof of the tent in the dark. My heart was pounding, and I tried to tell myself it was just deer or raccoons, maybe a bear. I'd hung my food bag away from camp and didn't have any snacks inside the tent, so I knew I'd done everything right. But still, those sounds went on for hours. Close, then far, then close again. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the first light started to creep through the trees, I packed up and left camp without even eating. I needed to keep moving. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to get away from, but staying still felt dangerous. I kept thinking I'd find some explanation, maybe other campers or hunters, but I never saw anyone, not a single soul. That whole third day was a blur of hiking and paranoia. The trail was almost completely gone now, just faded cuts through the undergrowth that vanished every few hundred feet. I had to rely on the compass and map entirely. Around midday, I found what looked like an old fire ring. Stones in a rough circle, blackened in the center. But it was cold, no sign of recent use. Still, something about it bothered me. There were bones scattered nearby. Small ones, maybe rabbit or squirrel. Some broken, some whole. And some larger ones, too big for small game. I didn't want to look too closely. I told myself maybe it was just an old hunter's camp. But the bones weren't in a pile. They were spread out, almost like they'd been tossed. I kept moving. That night, I didn't set up camp. I just walked until my legs wouldn't carry me anymore. Then I collapsed in a shallow ravine under some low branches and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag without pitching the tent. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want to be found. I lay there all night, listening to the forest, every snap of a twig making me flinch. I heard something again, slow, deliberate steps through dry leaves. Not an animal, not the quick scurry of something four-legged. These were long, heavy steps, human. They passed by in the dark, maybe 30 feet from where I was hidden. I held my breath for minutes. My eyes were wide open, heart threatening to burst through my ribs. But whoever or whatever it was didn't stop, just kept moving through the trees until the sounds faded. I left before sunrise again. My legs were sore, my shoulders ached, and I hadn't eaten in almost a full day. I drank from a stream, filtered the water, and shoved some protein bars into my mouth while I hiked. I didn't even stop to rest. I was focused only on getting out now. I was supposed to finish the loop that day and head back toward where I parked, but I decided to shortcut west, using the sun to guide me until I could find the road. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted out. That shortcut almost killed me. The terrain got steeper, then turned into a maze of canyons and thick brush. I had to bushwhack for hours, tearing through thorns and branches, sliding down muddy slopes and scrambling back up rock walls. I slipped at one point badly and twisted my ankle. I thought it might have been broken, but after the shock wore off, I realized I could still limp on it. The pain was sharp and constant, but manageable. I kept going. I had no choice. Late that afternoon, I found the road. It was overgrown, barely more than a pair of ruts through the grass and trees, but it was real. I cried when I saw it. I followed it west for maybe 3 more miles until I finally reached my truck. Nothing had been touched. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for half an hour, staring at the trees. I never saw anyone, not one person the entire trip. But I know someone was out there. I know they watched me. I know they followed me. I filed a report with the Forest Service when I got back to town. They took notes, nodded, told me it was probably hunters or maybe I was just spooked by the isolation. But I knew better. Something was wrong out there. Something human. Something dangerous. I never went back, and I don't think I ever will. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. There's something calming about being deep in the woods with no one else around. No traffic noise, no conversations, just wind through the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I'm not someone who needs company to enjoy nature. I'd rather spend 2 days with my own thoughts in the forest than an hour at a loud party. I've been doing solo hikes and short backpacking trips for years, so I'm not exactly inexperienced. I know how to read maps, I pack properly, and I've dealt with rough weather and minor injuries before. I've had some close calls, but nothing I'd call terrifying until last fall. This happened in early October, just as the leaves had turned orange and gold. I was up in northern Vermont, far from the more popular tourist trails, deep in a region of the forest that barely showed up on standard maps. I'd driven up there on a Friday afternoon and parked at a small gravel lot near a ranger station that looked like it hadn't been staffed in months. My plan was simple: a 2-day out and back hike on a trail I'd never done before. It was part of an old logging road that connected to a less traveled section of the Appalachian Trail, then looped back through some smaller side trails. According to a few online forums I'd read, the trail was unmaintained, lightly used, and quiet, exactly what I wanted. The first few miles were peaceful. The weather was perfect, high 50s during the day, cool enough to need a jacket at night. I passed under huge maples and birches, their leaves thick on the ground, muting the sound of my footsteps. Occasionally I'd stop and just listen. There was that distant sound of a breeze moving high above, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. No birds, which I thought was a little odd for that time of day, but I didn't think much of it. I didn't see a single person that entire afternoon, which was fine by me. Around 4 hours in, I reached a fork. One path led up a steeper ridge, while the other followed the edge of a ravine, curving eastward. My map didn't mark the fork clearly, but I remembered reading about it online. The trail to the ridge looped back in a wider arc, so I figured I'd take the ravine route, shorter and easier. That decision probably changed everything. The ravine trail started off fine. It narrowed a bit, and the terrain got rougher, but nothing I couldn't handle. I kept going, occasionally checking my compass and map just to be sure I was still on track. After another hour or so, I found a decent flat area beneath a rock overhang that looked like a good place to camp. I set up my small tent, made a quick meal from a freeze-dried pouch, and sat on a log while the sun set behind the ridge. The woods felt a little too quiet. No insects buzzing, no owls, but I chalked it up to the cool temperatures. I fell asleep early. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving. Not close, but not far either. I've heard deer, raccoons, even the occasional black bear while camping, so it wasn't a big deal at first. The noise was rhythmic, crunching leaves, snapping twigs, like footsteps. Slow ones, not a deer trotting or a bear foraging, more like someone walking. I sat up, heart racing. My tent was zipped shut, and the fire was long out, so I couldn't see anything. I held still and listened. The footsteps came and went. They circled the area, sometimes close, sometimes farther. I never heard breathing, never saw a light, just footsteps on dry leaves, deliberate and slow. After maybe 15 minutes, they faded. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I packed quickly. I looked around the campsite but didn't see any tracks. The leaf cover was thick, so it'd be hard to tell anyway. I told myself it had just been an animal, even though deep down I didn't believe it. I started hiking again, wanting to finish the loop and get back to the car by that evening. The trail looked a little more overgrown than I remembered, but I assumed I just hadn't noticed on the way in. After a couple of miles, I realized I hadn't passed a few of the landmarks I'd seen the day before. A split boulder, a moss-covered log. I kept looking for them, but nothing matched. I pulled out my compass. I was still heading generally west, which should have been right, but the trail felt wrong. Curved too much, dipped into valleys I didn't remember, climbed ridges I didn't expect. I stopped and double-checked my map. There was no obvious error, but nothing around me matched. That's when I came to another fork in the trail. One path looked like it continued along a slope. The other dipped down toward a stream. Neither looked familiar. I picked the stream path, thinking water might help me orient myself. That was another mistake. The trail vanished after about 20 minutes. It didn't just fade, it was gone. 1 minute I was walking along a clear, narrow path with trampled leaves and packed dirt, and the next it was just forest. No trail markers, no footprints, no broken branches. I turned around, but the path behind me didn't look like anything. Just trees in every direction. My stomach dropped. I've gone off trail before by accident, but never like this. Never this suddenly or this completely. I took out my compass and map again. I decided to keep heading west. That should eventually bring me back toward the loop, or at least close to a road. I wasn't far enough into the forest to be truly lost. At least that's what I told myself. I walked for hours, checking my bearings every 20 minutes. The terrain got rougher, more rocks, thicker brush. Eventually, the forest opened up into a narrow, flat clearing that looked man-made. There were a few rotting posts sticking out of the ground, like fence remains or old logging markers. In the center of the clearing was something that made me stop cold. A pile of old clothes, jackets, boots, torn shirts, all dumped together in a heap. Some were shredded, some half buried in leaves, but all of them looked old, like they'd been there for years. I stared at them for a long time. There was no sign of backpacks or gear, just clothing, some of it clearly weathered and sun-bleached. It didn't look like trash. It looked like someone had gathered it deliberately. I didn't go near the pile. I turned around and kept walking. My legs started to ache around mid-afternoon, but I didn't want to stop. I was sweating even though it was cold. I hadn't seen a trail in hours, just trees. Every once in a while I thought I saw something in the distance, like a shape ducking behind a trunk or a darker shadow against the leaves. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Could have just been my nerves, or maybe I was being followed. I set up camp before sunset in a dense grove of fir trees. I didn't eat. I just lay in the tent with the zipper pulled tight, my knife in my hand. I didn't hear anything that night, but I barely slept. Every time a twig snapped outside, I tensed up. I kept imagining someone creeping through the trees, just out of view. The next morning, I found footprints. Not mine. These were bigger, heavier, and deeper. They circled the campsite, coming close to the tent at least twice. They weren't animal prints. They looked like boots. I didn't think. I just grabbed my gear and started hiking west again. I moved fast. I didn't care about getting tired or lost. I just wanted to get away from that grove. After another hour, I started hearing something behind me. Not footsteps, but a kind of rustling that came and went. It never got close, but it stayed with me for most of the day. Around mid-afternoon, I finally found a trail, a real one. It was overgrown, but I recognized a trail marker nailed to a tree. It was weathered, but it matched the ones from the main loop. I followed it, hoping it would lead back to the parking lot. It did eventually, but not before I passed another strange spot. This time it was an old campsite, long abandoned. A rusted-out tent frame, a torn tarp, half-buried cans, and a boot. One boot, tipped on its side, full of water. No bones, no bodies. Just signs that someone had once camped there and never cleaned up. It looked like it had been there for years, and judging by the thick moss on the tarp, it probably had. I didn't stop. I kept walking until I reached the gravel lot, just as the sun started to dip behind the trees. My car was still there. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I hit a town with cell service. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just said I got turned around and spent an extra night in the woods. I didn't report the clothes or the campsite or the footprints. I wasn't even sure what I'd report. There was no crime, just weirdness. But something's out there in those woods. Something that isn't a ghost or a monster or some backwoods legend. Something real. Maybe it's a person, maybe it's more than one. Maybe it's someone who lives out there, watching people, following hikers who wander too far off trail. Or maybe it's just someone who doesn't want to be found and doesn't want you leaving once you do. I still hike, but I don't go off trail anymore. I don't ignore my instincts, and I don't hike alone. Not after what happened up there. I don't like thinking about this, but sometimes I catch myself drifting back to that week. It's like a scar in my memory. Still there, even if it's mostly healed. This happened about 3 years ago when I took a solo trip up north, deep into the boreal forest. It was one of those trips where I wanted to be far from everything. No cell signal, no towns nearby, just thick woods and time to myself. I had a rough patch that year, and I thought disappearing into the trees for a while might clear my head. I was wrong. I'd found an old logging road on a satellite map. It wasn't on most GPS systems anymore, but I could see it faintly, winding its way 30 miles past the last recognizable forest road. That's where I decided to go. I packed up my truck with everything I needed: tent, food, water, tools, backup gear, and some old paper maps just in case. The plan was to camp deep in, maybe hike further, and make a loop over 5 or 6 days. Nothing fancy, just me, the trees, and the sound of wind and birds. The drive took most of the day. I left pavement behind after a couple hours, and the road got worse the farther I went. The last stretch was that faded logging road, just 2 ruts barely visible through the undergrowth, with grass and weeds growing in the middle. I had to crawl along in 4-wheel drive, bouncing over old washouts and dodging down limbs. Eventually, the trees swallowed the road completely, and I parked in a clearing where the sunlight just barely touched the ground. Felt like the right spot, quiet, untouched, maybe too quiet now that I think about it. The first 2 days were uneventful. I set up camp beside a small creek, spent my time hiking, cooking over the fire, and scribbling in a little notebook I brought. It was the kind of silence you can only get way out in the wild. I didn't see another person or even hear a plane overhead. Just rustling leaves, the distant call of loons at night, and the crackle of my fire. But on the third day, something shifted. I had hiked out in a wide circle, trying to track the edges of the old logging road further in. That road was strange. Parts of it were completely overgrown, like the forest was reclaiming it faster than normal. But then I'd find sections that looked disturbed, not cleared exactly but tamped down, like someone had passed through not long before. Not tire tracks, just the sense that vegetation had been pushed aside. I assumed it was animals at first, maybe moose or deer moving through, but the spacing wasn't right. Too narrow for moose, too wide for deer. I didn't think much of it until I started noticing other things. Small things, a snapped branch here, a cut sapling there, bits of bark shaved off trees. Not random damage either, deliberate cuts, clean and angled like someone had used a knife or machete. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe hunters had been through. Maybe someone was maintaining a trail. Whatever. But when I got back to camp that evening, something was off. I knew immediately. The fire pit looked slightly different. More ash than I'd left that morning. A couple of my logs had been moved from the woodpile. And worst of all, my backpack was unzipped. I hadn't touched it all day. I stood there staring at it for a long time, heart thudding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I left it open. Maybe I forgot about the fire. But I don't forget those things, especially not out there. I did a quick check of my gear. Nothing was missing. Nothing obvious, anyway. Food was still sealed. Knife was still in its sheath. My spare clothes were where I left them. But the more I looked, the more it felt like someone had gone through it. Not to steal, just to look. That was worse somehow. The idea that someone had come and rummaged through my things while I was gone made my skin crawl. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept my knife close and let the fire burn longer than usual. Every little sound outside made me sit up and listen. Cracking branches, the wind moving through the trees, a splash in the creek. I told myself it was nothing, but I stayed awake most of the night anyway, listening. The next day, I packed up early and moved camp further in, away from the road. I thought maybe I'd find a better spot, something more secluded, just in case someone had found my camp. I hiked another 3 or 4 miles deeper and set up beside a small rocky outcrop, where I could see down into a low marsh. It was beautiful and quiet. I felt better for a while. But that evening, as the sun was dipping, I climbed the rocks behind me to get a better view. That's when I saw it. Across the marsh, maybe a few hundred yards off, someone had built a lean-to. It was rough, made from branches and bark, tucked between 2 trees. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out how old it was. The materials looked fresh. No rot, no moss, like it had been made in the last week or 2. And worse, the area around it looked used. Flattened grass, signs of movement. I didn't go over to it. Something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I went back to my camp and tried to convince myself it was left by a hunter or a trapper. Maybe someone else was out there. Maybe they were just doing the same thing I was, getting away for a bit. But it didn't sit right with me. I never heard anyone. No fires, no voices, no tools or movement. Whoever it was, they were being quiet. Too quiet. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, not animal footsteps. Human, crunching softly over leaves and twigs, circling the tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there with my knife gripped in both hands, eyes wide in the darkness. They stopped for a long time, maybe 10, 20 minutes. Then the footsteps retreated, faded into the woods. I didn't hear them again. To first light, I broke camp. I didn't bother eating. I stuffed everything into my pack, slung it over my shoulders, and started hiking, fast. I didn't follow the trail I came in on. I cut through the forest in a straight line, aiming for where I remembered the old road ran. I figured if I could get back to the truck, I could be out by sunset, but I got turned around. The trees were thick, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I stopped checking my compass, stopped checking the map. I just moved, for hours. And when I finally recognized a landmark, a broken birch with 2 trunks, I realized I was back near that lean-to. It was closer now. I could see it better, and this time there was smoke rising from it. I didn't wait around to see who was there. I bolted in the opposite direction, pushing through undergrowth, getting scratched and cut, barely stopping to drink. I didn't care about stealth anymore. I just wanted out. But the woods weren't done with me. That evening, exhausted and hungry, I stumbled into another clearing, one I didn't recognize. At first I thought I might be near the road again, but the clearing was wrong. Too square, too deliberate, and in the middle was a post. Just a single wooden post, about 5 feet high, with a piece of torn fabric nailed to it. The fabric looked like part of a shirt. There were boot prints around the post, big ones, deep, like someone had stood there watching, or waiting. I backed out of that clearing and kept moving until dark. I slept curled at the base of a tree, shivering in the cold, not bothering with the tent. I didn't dare make a fire. The moonlight was enough to see shapes moving in the distance, too far to make out, but there. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I finally caught a break. I found the logging road. It was further west than I thought, but the ruts and overgrowth were unmistakable. I followed it until my feet felt like they were falling apart, and by late afternoon, I saw the glint of sunlight off my truck windshield through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached the door. Everything was exactly how I left it. Doors locked, windows intact. I climbed in, locked the doors behind me, and didn't stop driving until I was back on pavement. Then another hour after that, back to the first town with cell service. I never reported it. What would I even say? There were no laws against someone being out there. No proof anyone did anything illegal. But I know what I saw. I know someone was watching me, stalking me, maybe someone who didn't want me there. I haven't been back in the deep woods since. I still camp sometimes, but only in parks now, places with other people nearby, maybe a ranger station within radio distance. I lost something in those trees. Maybe trust, maybe peace. I still dream about it sometimes. Those footsteps outside the tent, the smoke curling from that shelter, the fabric nailed to that post. Maybe it was just some backwoods loner trying to scare me off. Maybe I stumbled into someone's hidden camp. But the silence of it all, the absence of any trace on the way in, the carefulness, the watching, that's what keeps me up at night. The woods are big, bigger than you think. And some places out there, they don't belong to you. They never did.